Part 1. The Widow and the White Hell. The wind came down from the peaks of the bitter roots like a thing alive, a beast of ice and fury that had slept for 100 years and woken up hungry. It screamed through the pines, tearing at the boughs until they threw off their coats of snow in great, shuddering clouds. For 3 days. It had not stopped. For 3 days. The Montana Territory had been a white hell. Inside his cabin, Samuel Whitaker moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who knew the cost of a wasted motion. The cold was a physical presence, a constant pressure against the log walls, searching for any chink in the daubing. He fed another piece of pine into the potbelly stove, the wood-spitting resin that filled the single room with a sharp, clean scent, the only smell that could cut through the lingering phantom of wood smoke and solitude. He was a man carved from the same hard timber as his cabin, broad in the shoulder and spare in the middle, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow. His hands, calloused and capable, were never truly still. When he wasn't mending a harness or sharpening his axe, they would clench and unclench at his sides, as if grasping for something that was no longer there. It had been 2 years since the fever took his Sarah and little Jacob. 2 years since the silence in this cabin had ceased to be peaceful and became a hollow ache. He had come to this valley seeking a new start, but all he'd found was a place to bury his dead and himself along with them. Now, his only ambition was to endure the seasons, one after the other, until they blurred into a life lived. The storm was a worthy adversary. It tested the new section of roof he'd patched before the first snows, and it found a weakness. A slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip began near the stone hearth. Samuel watched the spot on the floorboards darken, his jaw tight. It wasn't just water, it was a breach, a reminder that nothing he built was ever truly safe from the world's wearing down. He placed a tin pail beneath the leak and made a mental note of the shingles he'd need to replace, a task added to a ledger of survival that never seemed to shrink. By the 4th morning, the wind had quieted to a mournful sigh, and the world outside was a stunning, unbroken expanse of white. The snow lay 4 feet deep in the clearing, drifted higher against the north wall of the cabin and the half-finished fence line. His stores were running low. Coffee, flour, salt, necessities. The trail to Hamilton would be treacherous, but starvation was a more certain threat than a snow-choked path. He spent the morning clearing away to the lean-to where his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, waited patiently. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, each breath a plume of white vapor. Gideon snorted, his own breath smoking, and nudged Samuel's shoulder as if to ask what had taken so long. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, his voice a rough sound in the profound quiet. It was the first word he'd spoken in days. The ride into town was a battle. Gideon plunged through drifts that came up to his chest, muscles straining. The world was remade, familiar landmarks buried under a soft, merciless blanket. Samuel kept his eyes on the familiar shapes of the highest peaks, navigating by instinct. It was halfway to Hamilton, where the trail dipped to follow the course of a frozen creek, that he saw it. Tucked into a copse of aspen trees, barely visible, was a cabin. It was more of a shanty, really a slapdash affair of unpeeled logs and a sod roof that sagged dangerously in the middle. He'd passed this way a dozen times and barely noted its existence, dismissing it as some trapper's abandoned line shack. But today, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from its mud and stick chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast emptiness. As he drew nearer, the cabin's front door creaked open. A woman emerged, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. She carried 2 wooden buckets, her shoulders hunched against the wind that swept down the creek bed. Behind her, 2 small figures appeared in the doorway, a boy of about 7 or 8 and a girl a few years younger, both thin and pale. They watched their mother with wide, solemn eyes. The woman fought her way to the creek, where a patch of ice had been broken. The wind tore at her shawl, whipping her dark hair across her face. She knelt, her movement stiff with cold, and began the arduous task of dipping a bucket into the frigid water, the weight of it making her arm tremble. Samuel pulled Gideon to a halt behind a screen of snow-laden firs. An unwilling witness, he watched her make the slow, agonizing trip back to the cabin, leaning into the wind, one bucket at a time. The boy, Ethan, darted out to try and help, his small hands barely able to get a grip on the bale. She shooed him back with a sharp word that the wind stole before it could reach Samuel's ears, but the gesture was clear. This was her burden. He saw the fierce, desperate pride in the set of her jaw, the straightness of her back. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders when she finally deposited the buckets inside and leaned against the doorframe for a moment. Her head bowed. Something twisted in Samuel's gut. A hard, cold knot. He should ride on. It was not his concern. In this territory, every family fought its own battles. To interfere was to invite complication, and complication was the last thing he wanted. His life was stripped down to the studs, simple and stark. He intended to keep it that way. He nudged Gideon forward, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead, but the image was seared into his mind, the woman's chapped hands, the boy's hopeful, useless gesture, the little girl, Mary, a ghost in the dark doorway. It reminded him of stories his own mother used to tell, of winters so lean they'd boiled leather from old boots for soup. It was a poverty of means. But what he saw back there was a poverty of hope, and that was a far colder thing. He rode on, forcing the rhythm of the horse's gait to pound the image from his head. Hamilton was subdued, its main street carved into deep trenches of snow. Men shoveled paths with grim determination. At the general store, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, sawdust, and brewing coffee. Samuel gathered his supplies: flour, beans, a slab of bacon, coffee, and precious salt. As Mr. Abernathy tallied the bill, 2 women stood by the stove, their voices low but caring in the quiet store. A shame is what it is. One of them, a stout woman with a face like a worried prune, was saying, left with those 2 children and not a penny to her name, and the shame of it all. They say James Callahan was into it deep with some railroad men from Missoula, her companion whispered, leaning closer. Gambling debts. Just up and vanished one night, left her to face the music. Samuel froze, his hand halfway to his coin purse. Callahan. So that was her name. Rose Callahan. She's a proud one. That Rose, the first woman clucked. Too proud. Pastor Allen offered help from the church fund, and she turned him down flat. Said she'd manage on her own. Pride don't fill a belly. The others sniffed, and it won't keep that roof over their heads. I hear Silas Vane has his eye on that whole stretch along the creek. Samuel paid his bill, his movements stiff. He nodded curtly to Abernathy and left, the women's gossip clinging to him like burrs. So, she was a widow or as good as one, a woman alone, with 2 children and a husband who'd left a legacy of debt and disgrace. It explained the fierce set of her jaw. It was armor. The ride home was slower, the setting sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The knot in his gut had returned, tighter than before. He was a survivor. He had lived when Sarah and Jacob had not, for 2 years. He had carried that guilt like a stone in his pocket, a secret weight that shaped his days. He had told himself that his solitude was a kind of penance, a fitting tribute to their memory. To live quietly, to bother no one, to want nothing that was his pact with the ghosts who shared his cabin. But seeing Rose Callahan and her children had stirred something he'd thought long dead. It wasn't pity. Not exactly. It was a disquieting sense of recognition. He recognized the fight. He understood the kind of pride that made you starve rather than accept a hand you couldn't repay. That night, the silence was different. It wasn't the familiar, comforting quiet of a man alone with his thoughts. It was an accusing silence. filled with the images of the day, a thin curl of smoke, a wind-battered woman, two small, pale faces in a dark doorway. He ate his meal of bacon and beans without tasting it, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the stove. The dripping from the roof had stopped as the evening temperature plummeted, freezing the thaw. The world was locked in ice again. He had survived. Was this all it was for, to sit in a warm cabin while a woman and her children shivered and struggled less than a mile down the creek? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. His pact with his ghosts suddenly felt less like penance and more like cowardice. He slept poorly, tormented by dreams of reaching hands he couldn't grasp. He woke before dawn, the decision already made. It wasn't a thought, but a physical compulsion, an urgency that propelled him from his cot. He stoked the fire and, from his precious stores, measured out flour. His movements were sure and practiced as he mixed the dough. Sarah had taught him how to bake bread. "A man who can't feed himself is half a man," she'd teased, her hands guiding his clumsy ones. The memory came unbidden, sharp and sweet, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't bring a wave of incapacitating grief. It brought only a quiet sadness, a memory of warmth. As the loaf baked, filling the cabin with a smell that was the very essence of home, he went to the small pantry. He had a cow, a good milker he kept for his own needs. He took a clean tin pail and filled it with fresh, warm milk, the steam rising from its surface in the frigid air. With the loaf wrapped in a clean piece of sacking, he took the bread and the milk and walked. He didn't take Gideon. A man on horseback was a visitor. A man on foot was just a neighbor. He moved silently through the pre-dawn gloom, his boots crunching on the crusted snow. He reached the Callahan place as the first pale light began to touch the eastern peaks. The cabin was dark and still. He approached the sagging porch, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This felt transgressive, a violation of his own rigid rules. He placed the warm loaf and the pail of milk on the top step, right in front of the door where she couldn't miss it. Then, without a backward glance, he turned and walked away, his tracks the only evidence of his trespass. He spent the day working on his fence line, the physical labor a balm for his troubled mind. He chopped through ice and dug post holes in the frozen ground, his muscles burning with the effort. He did not look toward the creek. He did not allow himself to wonder. Late in the afternoon, as he was heading back to the cabin, he saw it, there, sitting on top of a fence post that marked the edge of his property, was the loaf of bread. It was still wrapped in the sacking. The tin pail was gone. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. She had taken the milk, a concession to her children's need. He guessed, but she had returned the bread. It was a clear message, delivered without a single word. "We will not accept charity." He looked at the loaf, a perfect golden brown symbol of his failed attempt to connect. He felt a strange mix of frustration and respect. She had backbone, this Rose Callahan. He took the bread from the post. He didn't feel chased off. He felt challenged. He walked back to his cabin, the rejected offering heavy in his hand. The silence that greeted him was the same as it had been for 2 years. But something had shifted. It was no longer a question. It was a dare. Part 2. The Bread and Milk Man. Samuel stood in the stark quiet of his own cabin, the returned loaf of bread cool in his hands. It was not an insult. He understood that. It was a declaration, as clear as if it had been shouted across the snow-filled valley. "I am not a charity case." He broke off a piece of the bread and ate it, the taste of his own effort mingling with the sharp tang of her pride. He respected it, but respect wouldn't keep the cold from the bones of her 2 children. That night, he didn't question his course of action. The path had been laid out for him by something deeper than conscious thought. His solitude had been a fortress, but a fortress protects from the outside. It doesn't heal what's broken on the inside. For the first time in 2 years, He felt a crack in his own walls. The next morning, an hour before the sun, he was back at his routine. He baked another loaf, this one with a handful of raisins from his own dwindling supply worked into the dough. He filled the tin pail with milk, still warm and frothy. But this time, he added something else. From the seasoned woodpile behind his cabin pine and birch, split and stacked to dry since late summer, he selected 4 stout logs. They were heavy and dense, guaranteed to burn long and hot. He tied them with a bit of twine and carried the bundle with the bread and milk. He left the offerings in the same spot on her porch step. The wood was a practical matter. It was fuel, not a gift. It was a thing to be burned, to be used up. Pride, he reasoned, might choke on a loaf of bread, but it would have a harder time refusing the simple logic of a warm fire. He turned and left, his footsteps the only sound in the sleeping world. For 3 days, the silent ritual continued. Each morning he would arrive in the blue-black darkness to find the pail from the day before, empty and clean, sitting on the step. He would replace it with a full one, a new loaf, and another bundle of firewood. And each afternoon, when he returned from his work, the pail would be back on his side of the property line, waiting for him. She was accepting the provisions, but she was still maintaining the distance, drawing a clear line in the snow between them. He did not cross it. He was learning a new kind of patience. This wasn't the patience of a farmer waiting for a crop or a hunter waiting for game. It was the patience of giving without the expectation of receiving anything in return, not a word, not a nod, not even a look. It was an act performed for its own sake, with each pre-dawn delivery. He felt as though he were chipping away at the ice that had encased his own heart, performing a duty that honored the memory of his wife and son in a way his hermetic grief never could. He was tending to the living, and it felt like penance and purpose rolled into one. On the 4th morning, something was different. As he approached the Callahan cabin, he saw a small, metallic glint on the porch step in the faint starlight. It was a tin cup, placed neatly beside the empty milk pail. Samuel stopped, his breath misting in the frigid air. It was a small thing, a dented cup that had seen years of use, but it was a profound gesture. It was an invitation. She was no longer just accepting his milk. She was asking for it. She was meeting him at the threshold, not with words, but with a silent admission of need. The invisible wall between them had lowered by a few inches. He carefully poured milk from his pail into the cup before leaving the rest, his movements gentle, as if handling something fragile and precious. As the days warmed and the great thaw began, turning the valley into a muddy, slushy mess, the routine held. The tracks between their cabins became a well-worn path in the melting snow. He began to see signs of the children. One morning, he caught a flicker of movement in the cabin window as he turned to leave a small face peering out before quickly ducking away. Another day, while mending a section of his fence that bordered the woods along the creek, he felt a pair of eyes on him. He slowly turned his head. It was the boy, Ethan, half hidden behind the trunk of a large cottonwood. The boy watched with a serious, unblinking intensity, not with fear, but with a deep, consuming curiosity. He was watching the way Samuel expertly twisted the wire, the efficient strength in his hands. Samuel held the boy's gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The boy didn't nod back, but he didn't run either. He just continued to watch until Samuel went back to his work. A week later, he saw the little girl, Mary, on the porch. She was holding a crumb of the raisin bread he'd left, nibbling at it like a little mouse. When she saw him looking from a distance, her eyes went wide, but instead of hiding, a shy, tentative smile touched her lips before she darted back inside. The children were a bridge, their simple acceptance a stark contrast to the complexities of the adults. Through them, he could feel the life inside that worn-down cabin, a life that was now intertwined with his own morning ritual. But while a fragile trust was being built by the creek, Something else was growing in town. Hamilton ran on gossip as much as it ran on commerce, and a lone widower making daily visits to the cabin of a woman whose husband had vanished was a prime cut of speculation. When he rode in for supplies, he could feel it. The way conversations stopped when he entered the general store, the way the women would gather in tight knots, their glances following him down the aisle. The whispers were like biting flies, too quick to swat. Every morning, they say, under the cover of darkness, a woman alone is vulnerable. And some men— Samuel ignored it. He kept his face a mask of indifference, his transactions brief and polite. He knew the unwritten laws of the frontier. A woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily shattered. A man's intentions were always suspect. He knew his actions could be causing Rose Callahan more harm than good. But the thought of those children going hungry or cold was a far more immediate and visceral truth. The whispers took on a voice one evening at the saloon. It wasn't a place Samuel frequented, but he needed to speak to a rancher about some stray cattle, and the saloon was the only place to find him after sunset. The room was noisy, thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap whiskey. As he stood at the bar, a man stumbled into him, sloshing liquor from a dirty glass. It was Jed, a sometime cook from the eating house, a man with a perpetually sour disposition and eyes that were either angry or drunk, usually both. "Well, looky here," Jed slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's the bread and milk man." A few men at the bar snickered. Samuel didn't move, just looked at Jed, his expression unreadable. "Been making regular deliveries out to the Callahan place, I hear." Jed pushed on, emboldened by the small audience. He leaned closer, his breath foul. "Tell me, Whitaker, what's the price for your kindness, a woman like that? Husband gone, she must be willing to pay something extra to keep her young'uns warm." The insinuation was as ugly and rank as the man who spoke it. Samuel felt a familiar, hot coil of anger tighten in his belly. The man in him, the husband who had once protected a wife's honor, wanted to smash his fist into Jed's sneering face. He could feel the weight of his own body, the power in his shoulders. It would be easy. But he thought of Rose's fierce pride. A public brawl over her name would only drag it deeper into the mud. It would turn suspicion into fact in the town's small mind. It would humiliate her, and it would undo all the quiet work of the past weeks. So, he let the anger go. He unclenched the fist at his side and simply held Jed's gaze. He didn't speak. He just looked at him, his gray eyes as cold and flat as a winter sky. There was no fear in them, but no fury either. There was only a profound and chilling emptiness, a look that said Jed was so far beneath his notice he barely registered as human. Jed's drunken bravado faltered under the weight of that silent dismissal. He stammered, his sneer turning into a confused frown. He looked away first, muttering something under his breath as he shuffled back to his cronies. The moment had passed. Samuel finished his business with the rancher and left, the saloon's noise fading behind him. He had won, not by fighting, but by refusing to. He was learning that some battles were fought with stillness. The encounter solidified his resolve. The town could whisper all it wanted. He knew his purpose, and it had nothing to do with them. His world had shrunk to the quiet path between two cabins, to the silent exchange of sustenance and trust. A few days later, he decided to make a small basket for the bread, weaving it from supple willow branches he gathered by the creek. It seemed more fitting than the rough sacking. The next morning, he set out earlier than usual. A strange unease had settled over him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a deep, starless indigo. As he approached the Callahan cabin, he saw that the familiar landscape of his routine had been disturbed. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen mud. There on the porch, the little woven basket lay on its side, splintered. The loaf of bread was in the dirt, crushed and defiled, as if someone had deliberately stamped on it. And there, pressed deep into the ruined loaf and the soft earth beneath it, was a single, clear boot print. It was a large print, much larger than his own, with a distinctive V shape worn into the heel. Samuel stared at the print, a cold dread seeping into him that had nothing to do with the morning air. This wasn't the work of a hungry animal. This was an act of malice. It was a message. The steady, quiet rhythm of his days had just been broken. The whispers in town had followed him home, and they had left a threat on Rose Callahan's doorstep. Part 3. The storm descends. A heart opens. The trampled bread was a wound in the earth. Samuel stared at the V-shaped boot print, a clear and deliberate mark of contempt. He cleaned up the mess, his movements economical and grim, his knuckles white as he crumbled the ruined loaf and scattered it for the birds. He left the fresh milk and firewood as always, but now a new element was added to his morning ritual, a slow, sweeping survey of the surrounding woods. He was no longer just a provider. He was a watchman. For a week, an uneasy peace held. The empty pail and tin cup were always waiting for him, and the path between their cabins became more defined as the last of the snow melted, revealing the dark, damp soil of spring. But the air itself felt different, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the changing season. The threat of that single boot print lingered, an unspoken question hanging between the tall pines. Then the sky began to brood. The weather turned strange, unseasonable. The usual gentle spring rains were replaced by a cold, nagging drizzle that fell from a sky the color of a bruise. The wind shifted, coming not from the west with the promise of warmth, but howling down from the north, carrying the remembered chill of the high snowfields. It was a bitter, spiteful wind that clawed at the new leaves and rattled the window panes of Samuel's cabin like an angry ghost. The old-timers called it a backward storm, a last, vicious bite from a winter that refused to die. Samuel secured his cabin, checking the shutters and bringing in an extra load of firewood. He saw to Gideon, ensuring the lean-to was sound. His gaze kept drifting south, toward the creek. He thought of that sagging sod roof on the Callahan place, the makeshift chimney. It was a poor shelter against a fair day, let alone a tempest like this. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow just after dusk. The drizzle turned to a torrent, a sheet of gray water driven almost horizontal by the gale. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound that frayed the nerves. Samuel sat by his stove, the book in his lap unread, listening. Every gust that shook his own sturdy walls sent a fresh wave of anxiety through him. He imagined the inside of that shanty, the wind finding its way through 100 cracks, the children huddled together, the sound of their mother's fear, a low hum beneath the roar of the storm. He told himself it was not his place. He told himself she was proud, that she would see his interference as an insult. He fed these excuses to the growing unease in his gut, but they were thin sustenance. The memory of his own wife, Sarah, her fear of thunderstorms, her hand clutching his in the dark, rose up in him, sharp and painful. A man's job was to make his family feel safe. Who was making them feel safe down there by the creek? It was a sound, faint but distinct beneath the symphony of the storm, that finally broke his paralysis, a sharp, cracking noise, like a great bone snapping, followed by a low, grinding groan. It was the sound of timber giving way. He didn't hesitate. He pulled on his oilskin coat, grabbed his lantern, and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. The rain was blinding, cold as ice water, plastering his hair to his skull in seconds. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and water. He fought his way toward the creek, the lantern casting a feeble, dancing circle of light that did little to pierce the oppressive darkness. He smelled the wet earth and splintered wood before he saw it. The northwest corner of the Callahan cabin had collapsed. A massive pine, weakened at the roots by the thaw and pushed by the wind, had fallen. its weight crushing a section of the roof as if it were made of matchsticks. Rain and wind poured through the gaping hole. He found the door hanging open, banging on its leather hinges. Inside was chaos. Rose was trying to shove a crude table and chairs against the hole, a futile effort to block the deluge. Water swirled around her ankles. The children were huddled on the single bed, their face pale with terror in the flickering lamplight. Mary was crying, a thin, wailing sound that was almost lost in the wind. Ethan sat stiff and silent, his small hands clenched into fists, trying to be brave. Rose looked up as Samuel filled the doorway, her face a mask of desperation and shock. For a moment, her pride fought a silent battle with her fear. He could see it in her eyes. Then, as another gust of wind tore a loose piece of sod from the roof, fear won. "The roof! It's going!" she shouted over the roar. "You can't stay here," he yelled back, his voice a raw command. "Get the children. We're going to my place." There was no argument. He saw the fight go out of her, replaced by a wave of exhausted relief. She grabbed a thin blanket from the bed and wrapped it around Mary, who clung to her mother's neck. Samuel scooped the little girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of shivering bones. "Ethan," Samuel said, his voice steady and calm. "You're with me, son." He took the boy's hand. It was as cold as ice. Outside, the journey back was a nightmare. The creek had begun to overflow its banks, and the path was a river of mud. Samuel held Mary tight against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. He kept a firm grip on Ethan, half pulling the boy through the sucking muck. Rose followed close behind, her hand on Samuel's back, using him as an anchor in the swirling chaos. They stumbled into his cabin, bringing the storm in with them, puddles of water, the smell of rain and wet wool. He barred the door, shutting out the howl of the wind, and for a moment they all just stood there, dripping and gasping for breath in the sudden, shocking quiet. The warmth of the stove enveloped them. Samuel gently set Mary down. She immediately ran to her mother, burying her face in her skirts. He helped Ethan out of his soaked jacket and sat him on the hearth to warm himself. "There's a stew on the stove," he said to Rose, his voice returning to its usual quiet tone, "and I've got dry clothes. Not much for a lady, but they're warm." He gave her an old wool shirt and a pair of his trousers, then turned his back to give her privacy while she changed behind a blanket he strung up for a screen. He busied himself tending to the children, ladling stew into bowls, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he made sure they ate. When Rose emerged, his clothes hung loosely on her frame, but she was dry and the hunted look was gone from her eyes. She sat by the fire, her dark hair damp and curling around her face. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the muffled rage of the storm outside. The stew was thick with beans and smoked meat, and it was the most comforting thing any of them had ever tasted. After they had eaten, the children, exhausted by fear and cold, fell asleep on Samuel's cot, huddled together under every blanket he owned. Samuel and Rose sat at his small table, a single lamp casting a warm glow between them. The pot-belly stove radiated a deep, bone-soaking heat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She was looking at her hands, clasped on the table. It was the first time she had spoken directly to him beyond the necessities of the rescue. Samuel just nodded, giving her the space to continue if she chose. "I heard the tree groan," she said, her eyes distant. "I knew it was going to fall. For a second, I didn't know what to do. I just froze." She looked up at him, and he saw a raw vulnerability in her gaze that stripped away all her thorny pride. "I was so scared of being left alone again, scared I couldn't protect them." The words hung in the warm air between them. Left alone again. It was an echo of his own life, a fear he knew intimately. "I know what that's like," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone speak, to be the one left. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "I had a wife and a son," he said simply. The confession felt like letting go of a heavy stone he'd been carrying for 2 years. Fever took them both. The first winter we were here. Jacob, he was about Ethan's age. He saw the understanding dawn in her face, the shift from gratitude to a deeper, more profound empathy. She wasn't just a charity case to him. He understood loss. He understood the hollow space a family leaves behind. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I built this place for them," he continued, his gaze moving around the sturdy, quiet room. "Thought a man needed land, a homestead, freedom, but I learned something. A warm, safe roof over the people you care about. That's worth more than all the freedom in the world." They sat in a comfortable silence after that, the shared confession forging a bond that weeks of silent gift-giving never could. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. The storm broke just before dawn. They woke to a world washed clean. The sky a pale, clear blue. The air was crisp and cool, and the ground was littered with fallen branches. The damage to Rose's cabin looked even worse in the daylight. The great pine lay across the roof like a slain giant. They spent the day in a flurry of shared labor. Samuel, with his axe and saw, began the monumental task of sectioning the fallen tree. Rose, her face set with determination, worked alongside him, hauling the smaller branches away. Even Ethan helped, his small face serious as he stacked the wood that would become their winter fuel. There was no more talk of pride or charity. There was only the work, the shared goal of rebuilding. That afternoon, Samuel rode into Hamilton. The town was abuzz with stories of the storm, but the gossip took on a new, sharper edge when he pulled up to the general store. "He saw Mrs." Abernathy whispered to another woman as he passed, their eyes following him with undisguised curiosity. He ignored them, purchasing what he needed: a box of long nails, 2 sacks of flour, and 3 sheets of corrugated tin, an expensive but necessary purchase. Back at the creek, he set about repairing the roof. He showed Ethan how to hold a hammer, how to start a nail with a gentle tap before driving it home. The boy was a quick study, his earlier awe of Samuel transforming into a focused desire to learn. He watched, mimicked, and soon the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of 2 hammers echoed in the clearing. Rose brought them water, her movements no longer stiff with defensiveness. She watched Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite read, a mixture of gratitude, wonder, and something softer, something more hesitant. By evening, the hole was covered. The new tin sheets gleamed in the setting sun, a bright, hopeful patch on the old, weathered roof. Samuel fashioned a crude gutter from a split log to divert the rainwater, his practical knowledge a constant source of quiet wonder to her. As he gathered his tools, the day's work done, Rose stopped him. She stood on her own porch, the threshold that had been a barrier between them for so long. "You'll stay for supper?" she asked. It wasn't a question born of obligation. It was a simple, genuine invitation. "It's not much, just some stew from what you gave us." He looked from her face to the faces of her children standing in the doorway. Ethan, his knuckles scraped, looked at him with a newfound respect. Mary offered a small, shy smile. He stepped onto the porch, crossing the invisible line for the first time. "I'd like that very much," Samuel said. The door was open, and he was finally invited in. Part 4. The Enemy and the Law of the Jungle. The supper in Rose's cabin marked the beginning of a quiet shift, as subtle and profound as the turning of a season. The threshold, once a barrier, became a worn path. Samuel no longer left his offerings in the pre-dawn darkness. He brought them in the full light of morning. He would stay for a cup of coffee, the bitter brew a welcome warmth against the chill. And his presence began to feel less like that of a visitor and more like a missing piece of the landscape settling into place. He and Ethan fell into a natural rhythm of master and apprentice. There was always a fence to mend, a tool to sharpen, a loose board to fix. Samuel taught the boy how to read the grain of a piece of wood, how to tie a knot that wouldn't slip, how to listen to the language of the forest. He was not trying to replace the boy's father. He was simply teaching him the skills a man needed to stand on his own 2 feet in this unforgiving country. Ethan, in turn, absorbed the lessons with a silent, hungry intensity, his admiration for Samuel shining in his eyes. Rose watched them, a complex mix of emotions playing across her features. Gratitude was a constant, but it was now threaded with something more complicated. She saw the easy strength in Samuel, the steady competence that was the exact opposite of her husband James's restless, unreliable charm. She found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, her day not truly beginning until he arrived. A cautious, fragile hope, a thing she hadn't dared to feel for years, began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. This tentative peace was shattered on a bright Tuesday afternoon. A rider, a stranger on a sweat-streaked horse, galloped up to the edge of her yard, reined in sharply, and, without dismounting, tacked a folded piece of paper to her door with the point of his knife. He gave the cabin a long, dismissive look, wheeled his horse around, and was gone in a cloud of dust before Rose could even step outside. Samuel was there, helping Ethan repair a bucket, and they both watched the rider disappear. He walked to the door and pulled the knife free. It was a cheap, poorly balanced blade. He unfolded the paper. The document was written in a clerk's neat hand, but the words were cold and hard. It was an offer, from a party who wished to remain anonymous, to purchase her 40-acre plot. The price they offered was laughably low, an insult to the sweat and hope that had been poured into the land, however meager the results. But it was the final sentence that turned the air to ice. It would be wise to accept this generous offer, as this valley can be an unpredictable place for those without protection. Unfortunate accidents have a way of happening to property that is not well managed. Rose read the paper over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth, the color drained from her face. It wasn't a business proposal, it was a threat, wrapped in the thin veil of legality. "Who would do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The fragile sense of safety she had begun to feel was gone, replaced by the familiar, cold dread of being a target. Samuel's face was grim, his jaw set like granite. He recognized the tactic. It was the soft-gloved fist of greed, the way powerful men with money and influence pushed smaller folk out of their way. "It's a land grab," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Someone wants this stretch of creek bottom, and they want it cheap." His mind immediately went to the whispers he'd heard in town. Silas Vane has his eye on that whole stretch, and the talk of the railroad spur. A line through this valley would make the land 10 times more valuable overnight. "What do we do?" Rose asked, her eyes wide with fear. The wordway came out naturally, an unconscious admission of their new alliance. "For now," Samuel said, folding the paper and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "We do nothing. We wait. This is their first move. It's meant to scare you into selling for pennies. Don't let it." But the threat had poisoned the air. A few days later, 2 men rode up to the cabin. One was a hulking figure with a sullen, brutish face. The other was slighter, with shifty eyes and a sneer that seemed permanently fixed on his lips. As they dismounted, Samuel's eyes were drawn to the hulking man's boots. The left heel had a distinctive, V-shaped piece of worn leather. Samuel's blood ran cold. He felt a sudden, electric clarity, the trampled bread. It hadn't been a random act of drunken malice from someone in town. It had been a message, a scout's report. They had been watching this place, testing its defenses, long before the storm. "Ma'am," the shifty one said, tipping his hat to Rose with an oily courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Calloway. This here is Pike. We're here on behalf of a business concern, wondering if you'd had a chance to consider the offer that was left for you." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Rose. He didn't say a word, just looked at the two men, his gaze steady. He was not armed, but his presence was a solid, unmovable fact. "The offer was not acceptable," Rose said from behind him, her voice shaking slightly but firm. Calloway's sneer widened. "Not acceptable. It's a falling-down shack on a patch of mud. Ma'am, my employer is being generous. He has plans for this valley. Big plans. A railroad spur is coming through. Progress. You can't stand in the way of progress." He looked past her, at Samuel. "And who might you be, hired help?" "I'm a neighbor," Samuel said, his voice even. Pike, the large man, took a step forward. His bulk meant to intimidate. A neighbor ought to give good advice. He grunted, "Advise the lady to take the money and move on. Before her luck runs out." Samuel met his gaze. He could smell the stale whiskey on the man's breath. "This is her property," Samuel said quietly. "She's not selling." Calloway laughed. A short, ugly sound. "Her property. We'll see what the law has to say about that." He gestured to Pike, and the two men mounted their horses. "You'll be hearing from us," Calloway called back, and they rode off, leaving a trail of menace in their wake. That night, Rose was deeply unsettled. "The law? What did he mean, James? He took care of the papers for this land. He said it was ours, free and clear." A knot of suspicion tightened in Samuel's chest. A man who would abandon his family over gambling debts was not a man to be trusted with legal matters. "I'll ride into Hamilton tomorrow," he said. "I'll check the county records at the land office, just to be sure everything is in order." The next day, Samuel found himself in the dusty, quiet confines of the Ravalli County Land Registry. The clerk, a man named Peters with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked at him with mild curiosity. Samuel asked to see the plat book for the section along Bitterroot Creek. He spent an hour poring over the maps and ledgers, his rough finger tracing the lines of ownership. He found the Callahan plot easily enough, but when he looked at the corresponding entry in the deed book, his blood turned to ice. The property was not owned free and clear. There was a mortgage, a lien against the deed, held by a financing company he'd never heard of. It had been taken out by James Callahan 2 years ago, just a few months before he disappeared. "Peters," Samuel called, keeping his voice low. "This lien holder, Montana Forward Investments, who are they?" The clerk peered over his spectacles. "That's one of Mr. Vane's companies," he said, as if it were common knowledge. "He has a few of them. Buys up land for development." "Of course, Silas Vane." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. He asked to see the mortgage agreement itself. Peters, after a moment's hesitation, retrieved a folder from a back room. The document was filled with dense legal language, but Samuel, from his own years of homesteading and dealing with land claims, could decipher the important parts. The interest rate was exorbitant, and there was a balloon payment clause. A final, massive payment was due in 3 weeks. If it wasn't paid, the holder of the mortgage, Silas Vane, could foreclose and seize the property for the cost of the outstanding debt. James Callahan hadn't just abandoned his family. He had sold them out. He had signed their future away for a pittance, leaving Rose in a legal trap that was about to spring shut. He rode back to the cabin with the heavy news in his heart. He explained it to Rose as gently as he could, laying out the cold, hard facts of the mortgage. She listened in stunned silence, her face pale. The betrayal was a deeper wound than the abandonment had been. This was calculated. This was cruel. "He planned this," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears of anger and grief. "He knew. He left me here to fail." "He left you here to fight," Samuel corrected her, his voice firm. "He would not let her crumble. Not now." Her head snapped up, her eyes locking with his. In that moment, something shifted. The last vestiges of the helpless victim fell away, replaced by the steely resolve of a survivor. She was no longer just a woman enduring hardship. She was a woman defending her home, her children, her life. "So what do we do?" she asked again. But this time, the way was not an unconscious plea. It was a statement of partnership. She was in this fight with him. "First," Samuel said, a plan already forming in his mind, "we act like we own the place, because we do." The next morning, he brought over his post-hole digger and a bundle of new cedar posts. The original survey markers for the Callahan property were old and rotting, some of them knocked over or lost in the brush. Together, they spent the day re-establishing the boundaries of her land. It was hard, physical work. Samuel dug the holes, his muscles straining against the rocky soil. Rose and Ethan helped him set the new posts, their hands working alongside his. They worked in a comfortable silence, the thud of the tamper the only sound. Each post they set was an act of defiance. They were drawing a line in the dirt, a physical declaration to Silas Vane and his hired thugs. They were marking their territory, not with a flag or a weapon, but with the sweat of their own labor. This was their land, and they would not be moved. As they set the last post at the corner nearest the creek, Samuel looked at Rose. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair had come loose from its bun, and her hands were raw. He had never seen her look more beautiful. "They'll be back," she said, her voice steady. "I know," he replied. "And we'll be ready," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. They stood there for a long moment as the sun began to set, the 4 new corner posts standing straight and true. Silent sentinels guarding a small patch of ground that had just become a battlefield. Part 5. Conflict with nature and instinct. Trial by fire. The threat from Silas Vane settled over their days like a low-hanging fog. A constant, chilling presence. But life on the frontier did not pause for legal battles. There was land to be tilled, seeds to be sown. To plant a garden was an act of faith, a defiant declaration that they intended to be there for the harvest. And so, under a sky of brilliant, promising blue, they worked. Samuel, with his broad shoulders and steady strength, broke the hard, rocky soil near the cabin, turning it over with a borrowed plow and Gideon's patient assistance. The rich, dark earth smelled of life and possibility. Rose followed behind him, her hands, which he had only ever seen clenched in worry or work, now gentle as she dropped seeds into the furrows beans, squash, corn. Her movements were graceful, her face softened by the sun and the simple hope of the task. Ethan and Mary were a whirlwind of chaotic help. Mary, with a seriousness that belied her years, was in charge of dropping pumpkin seeds into small mounds of earth, her brow furrowed in concentration. Ethan, eager to prove his growing strength, hauled buckets of water from the creek, sloshing half of it down his legs but beaming with pride at every delivery. Laughter, a sound Samuel had not realized he'd missed so desperately, echoed in the small clearing. For a few hours, they were not a widow and a widower, not a threatened family and their protector. They were simply people, working together under the sun, building a future from a patch of dirt. Samuel paused, leaning on the handle of a heavy wood axe he'd been using to clear a stubborn root system. He watched Rose as she knelt in the soil, a stray piece of hair falling across her cheek. He watched Ethan explain to his sister the proper way to cover a seed. A feeling, warm and potent, swelled in his chest. It was something more than affection, deeper than responsibility. It was the feeling of a foundation settling, of roots taking hold not just in the earth, but in each other. It was terrifying. It was in that moment of quiet contentment that the world changed. It began with a sound, or rather, the lack of one. The cheerful chatter of the squirrels in the pines ceased. The birdsong fell silent. An abrupt, unnatural hush fell over the clearing. Samuel felt it first, a primal prickle on the back of his neck, the instinct of a man who has spent years listening to the wilderness. He straightened up slowly. his eyes scanning the dense line of fir and aspen that bordered the garden plot. "Rose," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge that made her look up instantly. "Get the children. Go inside. Now!" She saw the look on his face and didn't question it. "Ethan, Mary, come on, inside with me!" But it was too late. It emerged from the shadows of the forest, not with a roar, but with a silent, terrifying fluidity. A grizzly bear. It was massive, larger than any he had ever seen. Its brown fur thick and matted from a long winter's sleep. It was lean, its ribs showing faintly beneath its hide, and its small, black eyes held the cold, single-minded focus of starvation. The bear lifted its great head, its snout testing the air, the scent of turned earth and human beings pulling it forward. The children were between the cabin and the bear. Mary let out a small, terrified squeak and froze, her eyes wide saucers of fear. Ethan, bless his brave little heart, grabbed his sister's hand and tried to pull her back, his own face a mask of pale horror. Time seemed to slow, stretching into an unbearable, syrupy crawl. Samuel's mind was a flash of pure, cold calculation. The cabin was too far. His rifle was leaning against the porch, a lifetime away. All he had was the axe in his hand. He moved without thinking, his body reacting on pure instinct. He put himself directly between the bear and the children, a solid wall of human defiance. He raised the axe, not to swing it, but to make himself appear larger, more threatening. "Rose, get them behind me!" he roared, his voice a raw, guttural sound he didn't recognize as his own. The grizzly paused, its head low, swaying from side to side. It let out a low, guttural huff, a sound that vibrated in Samuel's bones. It was a warning. "This is my territory. You are my food." Samuel stood his ground. He could feel the children scrambling behind his legs, could hear Rose's choked sob. He did not look back. His entire world had narrowed to the space between himself and the hungry animal. He took a step forward, then another, making himself the sole focus of the bear's attention. He shouted again, a meaningless, primal yell of rage and protection. The bear rose up on its hind legs, a terrifying mountain of fur and muscle. It towered over him, blocking out the sun. Its roar was a physical force, a blast of sound that shook the very air. And then it dropped to all fours and charged. Everything happened in a blur of brown fur and black claws. Samuel braced himself, the axe held ready. The bear was impossibly fast. It swiped at him with a paw the size of a dinner plate, its long, curved claws glinting in the sun. He twisted away, bringing the axe handle up to deflect the blow, but the force of it was staggering. He felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left forearm as 3 of the claws found their mark, tearing through his thick shirt and the flesh beneath as if it were paper. He stumbled back, his arm suddenly numb and useless, warm blood soaking his sleeve, but he did not fall. Fueled by adrenaline and a ferocious, paternal rage, he let out another roar of his own and swung the heavy axe with his good arm, not at the bear, but at the ground in front of it. The blade bit deep into the earth, sending a spray of dirt and rocks into the animal's face. The sudden, unexpected counterattack, the sting of the debris in its eyes, and the sheer, unyielding fury of the man before it was enough. The bear hesitated. It was hungry, but it was not foolish. This prey was too much trouble. With a final, frustrated woof, it veered off, crashing back into the trees and disappearing as silently as it had arrived. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Samuel's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Then, the strength that had held him up vanished. The world swam before his eyes, and he dropped to one knee, clutching his bleeding arm. Samuel Rose's scream broke the spell. She rushed to him, her face ashen. She tore a strip from her apron and pressed it against the wound, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it steady. "Oh, goodness! Oh, goodness!" Ethan and Mary were crying. clinging to their mother's skirts. But Ethan's eyes were fixed on Samuel. He was not looking at the blood. He was looking at the man who had stood between him and death. The fear in his gaze was slowly being replaced by something else, something profound and absolute, the unwavering, unconditional trust a son places in his father. They helped him back to the cabin, Samuel leaning heavily on Rose, his face pale and beaded with sweat. She sat him in a chair by the table and began to tend to the wound. The cuts were deep, 3 parallel gashes running from his wrist to his elbow, bleeding freely. The smell of blood, coppery and sharp, filled the small room. "Hot water. Ethan," Rose commanded, her voice shaking but taking on a new, focused authority. "And the sewing kit from my trunk, the blue one." The boy moved without a word, his small face grim with purpose. Rose gently peeled away the tattered, blood-soaked sleeve. Her touch was hesitant at first, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the raw fear, the remembered pain of past betrayals, the terrifying intimacy of this moment. For a woman who had been hurt so badly, trusting a man enough to tend to his wounds was an act of supreme faith. He flinched as she began to clean the cuts, her touch sending jolts of fire up his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her own tears now mixing with the water in the basin. "Don't be," he grunted through clenched teeth. "Just get it done." Her hands steadied. The nurse, the mother, took over. Her touch became sure and efficient as she cleaned the wound of dirt and cloth. She threaded a needle, her movements precise. Stitching the torn flesh back together was a slow, agonizing process. He focused on her face, on the intense concentration in her eyes, on the way she bit her lower lip as she worked. He felt every pull of the thread, but the pain was distant, secondary to the profound connection that was being woven between them. Stitch by painful stitch. Ethan watched from the corner of the room, silent and still. He saw the pain on Samuel's face, saw the man's stoic endurance. He saw his mother's hands, once trembling, now steady and capable. He was witnessing a different kind of strength, a partnership forged not of words, but of shared crisis and quiet care. He was learning what it meant to be a man, and what it meant to be a family. When it was over, his arm was tightly bandaged with clean strips of linen. He felt weak and dizzy, the adrenaline having long since faded, leaving only a deep, throbbing ache. Rose gave him a cup of water, holding it to his lips. They sat in the quiet of the lamp-lit cabin as evening fell. The children were asleep, the terror of the day having given way to exhausted slumber. Rose sat on a stool beside his chair, her hands now resting, folded, in her lap. The silence was thick with unspoken emotions. "You would have died for them," she said finally, her voice soft with awe and disbelief. Samuel looked at his bandaged arm. "Some things are worth dying for." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand the depths of this quiet, solitary man. She had spent years building walls around her heart, thick and high, to protect herself and her children. But he had not tried to knock them down. He had simply stood outside, patiently, offering bread and milk, a new roof, and now, his own life. She reached out, her fingers hesitantly tracing the edge of the bandage on his arm. It was a touch as light as a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 words. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the war between the ghost of her husband's betrayal and the undeniable truth of the man sitting before her. "James," she began, her voice cracking. "He would have run. He would have saved himself." "I'm not him, Rose," Samuel said quietly. Her hand rested on his arm, no longer trembling. The warmth of her touch seemed to seep through the bandages, quieting the pain. "I know," she whispered, her gaze dropping. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Maybe I can learn to trust again." It was the smallest of confessions, a fragile tendril of hope reaching out in the darkness. But for Samuel, sitting in the quiet cabin with her hand on his arm, the painful, ragged scar beneath the bandage felt like a victory. It was a promise, written in his own flesh, a silent oath that he would always stand between her family and the wilderness. Part 6. The title scene and the heart's petition. The scar on Samuel's forearm healed into a silver tracery of 3 parallel lines, a permanent testament to the day the wilderness had tested him and found him worthy. As the weeks passed, the land itself seemed to heal from winter's harshness. The Bitterroot Valley exploded into a riot of green. Wildflowers dusted the meadows in shades of purple and gold, and the creek, once a frozen, sluggish thing, now chattered merrily over the stones. The garden they had planted together pushed stubborn green shoots through the dark soil, a testament to their shared act of faith. Their lives settled into a new rhythm, a quiet domesticity that felt as natural and essential as the rising of the sun. The morning delivery of bread and milk was no longer a solitary, pre-dawn mission. It had become a ritual, a small ceremony that marked the true start of their day. Samuel would walk over as the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, a woven basket in one hand and the familiar tin pail in the other. Ethan would be waiting to unlatch the small gate Samuel had built for the yard, a gesture of welcome that filled Samuel with a quiet, paternal pride. And little Mary, her shyness replaced by a bright-eyed affection, would run onto the porch, holding out the dented tin cup, her small hands cupped carefully around it as if it were a precious treasure. They would sit on the porch steps, the 3 of them, Samuel, Rose, and the children buzzing around them, and share a cup of coffee while the world woke up. They spoke of small things, the hawk circling overhead, the progress of the cornstalks, a funny-shaped cloud. They were building a life not with grand declarations, but with the small, sturdy bricks of shared mornings and easy conversation. The looming threat of Silas Vane and the mortgage felt like a distant storm cloud, a darkness on the horizon that they chose, for these brief, sunlit moments, to ignore. Samuel found himself a stranger to the man he had been. The hollow silence of his own cabin now felt oppressive, and he spent more and more of his waking hours at the Callahan place. He was not just a helper anymore. He was a teacher, a partner, a fixed point in their small universe. The ache of his own loss, the ghosts of Sarah and Jacob, had not vanished, but their memory was no longer a source of pain that drove him into solitude. Instead, it was a quiet well of sorrow that gave him a deeper capacity for empathy, a more profound understanding of what was at stake. He was not replacing his lost family. He was honoring them by choosing to live and to care. Once more. For Rose, the change was even more profound. The armor of her pride, forged in the fires of betrayal and hardship, had begun to melt away. She found herself smiling without thinking. Her laughter, once a rusty, unused thing, now coming more easily. She watched Samuel with her children, saw the patient way he showed Ethan how to hold a knife to whittle a piece of wood, the gentle way he lifted Mary onto his shoulders so she could see the world. He was everything James had not been: steady, reliable, present. The memory of her husband was a phantom that still haunted the edges of her heart. The fear of being abandoned, of trusting and being made a fool of, was a deep and powerful current. But Samuel's quiet, unwavering consistency was a seawall against that tide. He had never asked for anything. He had never pushed, never demanded. He had simply shown up, day after day, with bread and milk, with the nails for a roof, with his own body as a shield. He was teaching her, through his actions, that not all men run, some men stay. One late afternoon, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of pine and sun-baked earth. A gentle breeze drifted down from the mountains, carrying the sweet smell of dried grass. Rose was in the yard, hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 aspen trees. The white sheets billowed in the wind like the sails of a ship bound for a peaceful harbor. The children were down by the creek, their happy shouts a distant, musical sound. Samuel approached, his footsteps soft on the grass. He carried the day's bread, still warm from his oven, and the pail of evening milk. He paused at the edge of the yard, just watching her. She moved with an unhurried grace, her head tilted, a few loose strands of dark hair catching the golden afternoon light. In that moment, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. A portrait of resilience and quiet strength. The fear in his own heart was a cold, hard knot. He had spent years building a fortress of solitude, and he was about to willingly walk out of its gates, unarmed. To love again was to invite the possibility of loss again. It was a risk that made facing a grizzly bear feel like a simple chore. But to not take that risk, to turn and walk back to his empty cabin, suddenly felt like a cowardice he could not bear. He walked over to the porch and set the basket and pail on the top step. The same step where he had left his first furtive offering months ago. He filled the small tin cup that now lived there permanently, a silent sentinel of their connection. Rose turned, a small, welcoming smile on her face as she saw him. "You're quiet today, Samuel." He didn't return the smile. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, his heart hammering against his ribs. The laundry line was between them, a white, fluttering barrier. He looked at the ground, then forced himself to meet her eyes. He saw the question in them, the slight furrow of concern at his strange solemnity. He drew a breath, the words feeling rough and unfamiliar in his throat. His voice, when it came, was hoarse with an emotion that was equal parts terror and unwavering certainty. "Every day I brought bread and milk," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet carrying across the small space between them with perfect clarity. He took a step closer, pushing aside a billowing sheet so that he could see her face. "Until one day I whisper I bring you my heart, if you'll take it." The words hung in the warm, still air. They were not poetic. They were not polished. They were as plain and sturdy as the man who spoke them. It was not a demand or a declaration of passion. It was a simple offering, laid at her feet with the same humble sincerity as the bread and milk. It was a question, asking for nothing but an honest answer. The breeze died down. The happy shouts from the creek faded into the background. The world seemed to hold its breath. Rose stared at him, her eyes wide. The color rose in her cheeks, then receded, leaving her pale. He could see the storm of emotions in her gaze: shock, fear, and something else. Something deep and tremulous that looked like hope. She did not speak. She seemed unable to. Slowly, as if in a dream, she raised her hand. She didn't reach for his hand, or his face. She reached for his left arm, her fingers gently, reverently, touching the raised, silvery lines of the scar. She traced the path the bear's claws had taken, her touch sending a jolt through him that was more powerful than any pain. Her eyes filled with tears, which welled up and spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but whatever she was going to say was lost. A new sound intruded on their private world, the thunder of approaching horses, ridden hard. 2 riders burst from the tree line and reined in at the edge of the yard, their horses snorting and stamping. One was Sheriff Boyle, his face flushed and self-important, his tin star glinting on his vest. The other was the shifty-eyed man, Calloway. The tender, fragile moment was shattered. Rose snatched her hand back from Samuel's arm as if she'd been burned, her expression shifting from vulnerable hope to guarded fear. "Rose Callahan," Sheriff Boyle called out, his voice a pompous boom that was an offense to the quiet afternoon. He did not dismount. He held up a piece of paper. "I have here an official notice of foreclosure and eviction, filed by Montana Forward Investments. You have failed to meet the terms of your mortgage agreement." Samuel stepped forward, his body once again a shield between Rose and the threat. "She was never notified of any terms. Sheriff, this is Vane's doing. and you know it." Boyle's eyes narrowed. "I don't know anything about that. Whitaker. All I know is my duty. This is a legal document, signed by a judge. The law is the law." He squinted at the paper. "It says here you have 10 days to vacate the premises. 10 days. After that, you will be removed by force, if necessary." Calloway smirked, his eyes lingering on Rose with a look that made Samuel's blood boil. "My employer is a reasonable man," Calloway said, his voice slick. "He's still willing to buy you out, save you the trouble and shame of being thrown off your land. The original offer still stands." 10 days. The words fell like hammer blows. 10 days to find a way to fight a man who owned the law, or to lose everything. "Get off this land," Samuel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Boyle puffed out his chest. "You watch your tone. Whitaker, you're interfering with an officer of the law. I could arrest you for that." "Then do it," Samuel challenged, not backing down an inch. "Or get off this property." For a long moment, Boyle just stared, his bluster wilting slightly under the force of Samuel's cold, quiet fury. Finally, he tugged on his reins. 10 days, Mrs. Callahan," he repeated, turning his horse. "The law is the law." They galloped away, leaving the official notice fluttering in the dust where Boyle had dropped it. The silence they left behind was heavy and suffocating. Samuel turned back to Rose. The question he had asked her the offering of his heart was still hanging in the air, but it was now overshadowed by this new, immediate crisis. She walked slowly to where the paper lay and bent to pick it up. She held the eviction notice in her hands, the legal document a stark, black-and-white symbol of her impossible situation. Her face was a battleground of conflicting emotions. He could see the terror, the crushing weight of her predicament, but he could also see the memory of his words, the echo of his offer. She was standing at the ultimate threshold. She held 2 choices in her hands, one on paper and one in the air between them. She could sign the land away to Vane, accepting the pittance he offered for a life of defeated, but perhaps safe, anonymity. Or she could take the heart he had just offered her, and in doing so, choose to stay and fight a battle that seemed utterly hopeless. She looked from the paper in her hands to his face, to the scar on his arm, to the quiet strength in his eyes. Her own eyes were filled with tears, but also with a dawning, terrible clarity. Her choice was not just about land. It was about trust. It was about fear. It was about deciding, once and for all, if she could believe in a man who stays. Part 7. The Return and the Reckoning. The 10 days passed not like a reprieve, but like the slow tightening of a noose. They were days of feverish, quiet preparation. Samuel did not waste time cleaning his rifle or practicing his draw. Instead, he spent 2 full days in Hamilton, moving with a grim, relentless purpose. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy at the general store, to Pastor Allen, to a few quiet homesteaders who had also felt the pressure of Silas Vane's ambition. He spent hours in the land registry office, the clerk Peters now a nervous but willing accomplice, helping him unravel the tangled, dirty threads of Vane's business dealings. He returned to the cabin not with a plan for a gunfight, but with a leather satchel full of paper. He and Rose spoke little of his offer. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a question suspended in time, waiting for the coming storm to pass. But a new intimacy had been forged in the crucible of their shared crisis. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, their hands brushing as they worked, their eyes meeting across the supper table in a silent communion of resolve. He taught Ethan a simple emergency plan. If there's trouble, real trouble, and I tell you to run, you don't run away. You run to Gideon's stable. You open the gate. You understand, no matter what else is happening. You let the horses out. The boy had nodded, his face pale but his eyes steady, accepting the terrible responsibility. On the morning of the 10th day, the air was heavy and still. A tense quiet had fallen over the valley. Samuel stood on the porch, his bandaged arm a dull ache, his gaze fixed on the trail leading to town. Rose stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. They were waiting for the law to arrive. But the law was not the first to come. A lone rider appeared first, picking his way along the creek. He was not one of Vane's thugs. He was dressed in clothes that were a little too fine for the frontier, with a confident, easy slump in the saddle. As he drew closer, Rose let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her face went white. "James," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. It was James Callahan. He swung down from his horse with a practiced charm, a handsome man with a weak chin and restless eyes. He smiled at Rose, a brilliant, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who could talk his way out of anything. "Rose, my darling," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "I've come back for you." Behind him, a second rider emerged from the trees. It was the hulking brute, Pike, his face a sullen mask, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The pieces clicked into place in Samuel's mind with sickening clarity. "You," Rose breathed, her voice filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. "You're with them." James's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Now, Rose, it's not what you think. It's business. A man has to survive. Vane, he made me an offer. I owed him some money. You see, this was the only way to clear the slate. We just needed you off the land. I knew you wouldn't go willingly. So I had to step away for a bit, to let things play out." The callousness of it, the casual betrayal, was breathtaking. He hadn't just abandoned them. He had used them as pawns in his own pathetic game. "You left us to starve," Rose said, her voice trembling with a cold, rising fury. "You left us to face a winter in a collapsing cabin. For money. It's all for us. Don't you see," he pleaded, taking a step forward. "The money Vane is giving me, we can start fresh. California. Maybe leave this miserable place behind." "Get away from her," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. He stepped between them. James finally seemed to notice him, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "And who's this, the hired hand I heard you'd found yourself a stray dog to do your chores?" "Rose." Before Samuel could answer, the rest of the party arrived. Sheriff Boyle led the way, with Silas Vane riding beside him, looking smug and triumphant. Calloway and another hard-faced man brought up the rear. They were a small army, come to claim their prize. "Well, well," Vane said, dismounting. His eyes swept over the small cabin and the garden with contempt. "The 10th day. Time's up." He looked at James. "Callahan, I see you've made your introductions." "Sheriff," Vane said, turning to Boyle, "this man, Whitaker, is trespassing. He has been interfering with illegal foreclosure and inciting this woman to unlawfully occupy this property. I want him arrested." Boyle swelled with importance, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Samuel Whitaker, you're under arrest." He started to step forward. "On what charge?" Samuel's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. He didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood his ground, holding the leather satchel. "Resisting the law," Boyle blustered. "What law is that?" Sheriff Samuel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The law that allows a man to sign a mortgage for $500 and then have the paperwork altered to show a debt of $5,000. He opened the satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He held up a copy of the original loan application he'd found buried in a backroom file, next to a copy of the fraudulent mortgage document Vane had filed. The discrepancy was glaring. Vane's smile vanished. "That's a forgery." "Is it?" Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength. "And I suppose this is a forgery, too." He produced another paper. "It's a sworn affidavit from the clerk in Missoula who witnessed James Callahan lose $3,000 to you in a poker game. Silas, a game you paid him to lose, so you could put him in your debt and get your hands on this land." A murmur went through the small crowd that had begun to gather. Mr. Abernathy was there, and Pastor Allen, and half a dozen other homesteaders, their faces hard and grim. They had answered Samuel's call. "This is nonsense," Vane spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "Boyle, arrest him!" "And what about this?" Sheriff Samuel's voice boomed, overriding him. He held up the eviction notice, signed by Judge Miller. "Funny thing is, I sent a wire to the territorial capital. Judge Miller has been in Helena for the last 2 weeks, recovering from a broken leg. He hasn't signed a single document." He tossed the paper onto the ground. "The signature is a fake. This entire foreclosure is a fraud." The crowd pressed closer. Boyle looked from the papers in Samuel's hand to Vane's furious face, his own expression turning from pompous authority to panicked uncertainty. He was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid one. He could see the tide turning. It was Pike who broke the standoff. Seeing his employer cornered, he acted on crude instinct. With a snarl, he raised his rifle. "Enough of this talk." He didn't aim at Samuel. He aimed at the sky and fired, the blast shattering the tense silence. It was a move designed to create chaos, to scatter the crowd and allow his employers to regain control. But in the split second that all eyes turned to Pike, Samuel moved. He lunged at Rose, shoving her and Mary behind him as a second shot rang out. A searing pain tore through his right side, just above his hip. He staggered but kept his feet, the world narrowing to a pinprick of white-hot agony. "Ethan now," he bellowed. Through the ringing in his ears, he saw the boy. Ethan hadn't frozen. He hadn't cried. He had done exactly as he was told, a small, sprinting figure. He had reached the makeshift stable. With all his might, he threw the wooden bar on the gate. The 2 horses inside Gideon and James's mount bolted from the enclosure. Spooked by the gunshots, they charged into the yard, a storm of panicked horseflesh. James Callahan screamed and dove out of the way. Pike, trying to bring his rifle around for another shot, was caught completely by surprise. Gideon, in a blind panic, slammed into him, sending the big man flying. He landed with a sickening thud, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The chaos was total. Before Vane or Calloway could react, the homesteaders surged forward. Mr. Abernathy, a stout man in his 60s, tackled Calloway around the knees. 2 other farmers grabbed Silas Vane, pinning his arms behind his back. The fight was over before it had truly begun. Sheriff Boyle stood frozen, his hand on his pistol, his face a mask of utter shock. Pastor Allen walked up to him, his expression one of cold, righteous fury. "Sheriff Boyle," the pastor said, his voice ringing with authority. "As the moral authority in this town, I am relieving you of your duties, pending an investigation by a federal marshal." Boyle deflated, his authority vanishing into thin air. He offered no resistance as one of the farmers took his gun and his badge. In the sudden, ringing silence, only 2 figures were still standing apart. Rose, with her children huddled behind her, and James Callahan, who had picked himself up from the dirt. He looked at the scene at his captured partner, the disarmed sheriff. The hostile crowd and his bluster finally broke. He stumbled toward Rose, his face a mask of desperation. "Rose, please," he begged. "Come with me. We can still get away. We can start over." Rose looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Samuel, who was leaning against the porch railing, his hand pressed to his bleeding side, his face pale but his eyes clear and steady. She saw the man who had run, and the man who had stayed. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a certainty. She stepped forward, placing herself between James and Samuel. She looked her husband in the eye, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of fear or pity. "You abandoned your family once." "James!" "That was enough," she said, her words a final judgment. "Here, we choose the man who stays." James Callahan stared at her, the finality in her voice finally breaking through his selfish delusions. He saw that he had lost everything, not just the land, but the last shred of respect from the woman he had so casually thrown away. Without another word, he turned, scrambled onto his horse, and rode away, a disgraced ghost vanishing back into the wilderness that had spawned him. Part 7. A warm roof and a long road. The aftermath of the confrontation was a strange mixture of chaos and profound calm. As the homesteaders led a sputtering Silas Vane and a pale, defeated Sheriff Boyle away, the clearing by the creek transformed. It was no longer a battlefield but a gathering place. Mrs. Abernathy, her face a mixture of concern and fierce approval, immediately took charge of the children, shooing them inside the cabin with the promise of a peppermint stick. Rose, her own fear forgotten, went straight to Samuel. She pressed the clean cloth mister. Abernathy offered against the wound in his side, her hands surprisingly steady. The bullet had torn a nasty furrow along his ribs, painful and bloody, but it hadn't gone deep. He was lucky. As he leaned on her, the solid, living weight of him both a comfort and a terrifying responsibility. She looked at the faces of her neighbors. They were no longer watching her with suspicion or pity. They were watching with respect. They had seen her make her stand. They had seen the man who stood with her in the crucible of that violent morning. The Callahan place had ceased to be an outcast's shanty. It had become part of the community. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, in more ways than one. Samuel's recovery was slow but steady. He spent most of his time in a chair on Rose's porch, a reluctant invalid, while she tended to his wound with the same focused care she had shown with his arm. The roles were reversed, and this new vulnerability forged a different kind of bond between them. He, who had always been the giver, the protector, had to learn to receive, and she, who had always been so fiercely self-reliant, found a deep and abiding strength in caring for him. News from town trickled in with visits from Pastor Allen. A federal marshal had arrived and taken Vane, Boyle and their cohorts into custody. The fraudulent land claims were being unraveled, and it was clear Silas Vane's reign of intimidation was over. James Callahan, they heard, had been seen riding east, and no one expected to see him again. The threat had evaporated, leaving behind only the quiet work of rebuilding a life. On one of his visits, Pastor Allen brought another set of papers from the land office, with Samuel's guidance. Rose filed a homestead claim, officially registering the 40 acres in her own name, free and clear of any of James's debts or Vane's machinations. As she signed her name, Rose Callahan, on the document, her hand did not tremble. It was the signature of a woman who owned her own life. Summer deepened into autumn. The aspens on the mountainsides began to burnish into gold, and the air grew crisp with the promise of the coming cold. The garden, their shared act of faith, had flourished. The corn stood tall and heavy with ears. The squash vines were tangled with a bounty of green and yellow fruit, and the pumpkins, Mary's special charge, were round and orange, nestled amongst the broad leaves. The harvest was not a solitary chore, but a celebration. The Abernathys came over, as did 2 other families from neighboring homesteads. The men worked alongside Samuel, whose side was now healed enough for steady labor, bringing in the corn and squash. The women worked with Rose, canning and preserving, their cheerful chatter filling the small cabin. It was a day of shared work and shared abundance, a tangible symbol of the community that had been forged in the face of adversity. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, they gathered in the yard. The neighbors had brought pies and fresh-baked bread to supplement the feast Rose had prepared from her own garden. Someone produced a fiddle, and a soft, lively tune drifted on the cool evening air. In the midst of the quiet celebration, Samuel took Rose's hand. He led her to the edge of the yard, where Pastor Allen was waiting. The children, their faces scrubbed clean, stood beside the pastor, their eyes shining. There, with the last rays of the sun warming their faces and their friends as witnesses, they were married. There was no white dress, no fancy ceremony. Rose wore her simple Sunday best, and in her hair, she had tucked a sprig of purple aster that Mary had picked for her. Samuel stood tall and steady in a clean shirt, his gaze never leaving her face. Their vows were not flowery words, but simple, solid promises, spoken in low voices that carried the weight of all they had endured. He promised to stay, to protect, to build a life with her. She promised to trust, to love, to build a home with him. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, Samuel did not kiss her with a flourish of passion. He gently took her face in his hands and touched his lips to hers, a kiss that was a quiet seal on a sacred vow. Later that night, after the last of the neighbors had departed and the children were sound asleep in their beds, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. It was the first time they had been truly alone together as husband and wife. A single lamp burned on the table, casting a soft, warm glow on the log walls. Outside, a sliver of moon hung in a sky littered with stars. Rose sat on the hearth, brushing her long, dark hair. Samuel came and sat beside her, taking the brush from her hand and continuing the motion, his strokes long and gentle. They didn't speak for a long time, simply existing in the comfortable, intimate silence. "Are you scared?" she asked finally, her voice a near whisper. "Terrified," he answered with perfect honesty, and she smiled. "Are you?" "No," she said, and he knew it was the truth. "Tired of being scared. I'm ready to just be happy." He set the brush down and took her hand in his. It was a strong hand, the palm calloused from work, the fingers capable. It was the hand of a survivor. He turned it over and gently kissed the hardened skin of her palm, a gesture of reverence for the strength and the struggle it represented. It was a promise to honor her past and to share her future. She responded by taking his left hand and turning it over, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery lines of the scar on his forearm. It was a map of his own sacrifice, a mark of his character. Her touch was a silent acknowledgement, an acceptance of the man he was, scars and all. He stood and pulled her to her feet. He led her not to the bed, but to the window. They stood looking out at the vast, silent, star-dusted valley. The mountains were great, dark shadows against the sky. "It's a hard country," he murmured, his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "There will be other storms, other lean winters." "I know," she said, leaning her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. "But we won't face them alone." They stood there for a long time, sharing the warmth of their bodies against the cool night air, whispering not of passion, but of the children, of the seeds they would order for the spring, of the sturdy fence he planned to build on the north ridge. They were the quiet, hopeful plans of a husband and a wife, the foundational stones of a long road they would walk together. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Samuel, his side only a mild twinge now, walked with Ethan to check the fence line, the boy's stride long and confident as he tried to match the man's pace. They moved with the easy companionship of a father and son, their talk a low murmur of fence posts and the tracks of a deer. In the garden, Rose showed Mary how to collect seeds from the last of the sunflowers, their heads bowed together, their laughter a bright, clear sound that carried on the crisp morning air. Samuel paused at the edge of the woods and looked back at the small cabin, at the tin roof glinting in the sun, at the ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney, at his wife and daughter, their heads bent together over their work. He listened to the sound of their laughter, and to the rhythmic thud of Ethan's hammer as he secured a loose rail on the fence. For 2 years, the profound silence of the Bitterroot Valley had been a hollow, aching emptiness, a reflection of the void in his own soul. But now, the silence was different. It was filled with the rhythmic sounds of a life being built, with the echo of laughter, with the quiet, powerful hum of belonging. The silence of Bitterroot was no longer empty. It was full. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.